It ended without a raised voice, without witnesses, without the dignity of grief performed aloud, and that quiet was the true cruelty. In early 19th century England, where marriages were preserved as institutions long after affection had decayed, the Duchess learned that silence could wound more deeply than scandal. She signed her name with steady resolve, not because her heart was calm, but because surrendering to sorrow would have granted it power. The Duke watched, composed and distant, bound by a discipline he mistook for honor, believing restraint to be a shield rather than a wall. Their union had once promised harmony, arranged with care, approved by lineage, and celebrated for its suitability rather than its warmth. Affection came later, shy and imperfect, never spoken of openly, yet sufficient to suggest a shared future. What fractured them was not cruelty but misjudgment, and the slow corrosion of pride. Words withheld grew heavier than those exchanged, and each assumed the other unyielding. By the time misunderstanding hardened into certainty, apology felt impossible and dignity demanded separation. A private agreement was reached, discreet and final, sparing both families public embarrassment while exacting a subtler price. She would leave the estate quietly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement of what had been lost. He would remain, untouched by rumor, carrying the burden of being considered blameless. Society, ever efficient in assigning fault, would find its answers in her absence. The Duchess accepted these terms without protest, though each condition asked her to abandon not merely a title, but the life she had shaped within its confines. She did not argue that she had loved faithfully, nor that her silence had been mistaken for indifference. In an age that prized composure above confession, she had been taught to endure rather than explain. If she was to depart misunderstood, she would do so with the grace expected of her, even if that grace masked a private devastation. On the morning of her departure, there were no formal farewells. Servants moved with exaggerated care, sensing the weight of an event they were forbidden to name. Doors closed softly behind her, as though the house itself feared to disturb the moment. The Duke did not accompany her. He stood elsewhere, persuading himself that absence was mercy, that restraint would preserve order. In truth, he lacked the courage to speak what he had not yet admitted even to himself. As the Duchess left, she carried little beyond necessity, for possession seemed trivial beside what she was relinquishing. She did not look back. Memories she knew would follow without invitation. Her thoughts were not of anger, but of astonishment at how swiftly a life could be undone while remaining outwardly intact. She wondered whether dignity was strength, or merely another expectation placed upon women who were asked to suffer quietly. In the days that followed, the Duke returned to his routines with disciplined precision. He attended to estates, answered correspondence, and upheld appearances with faultless courtesy. Those who observed him noted no change and praised his composure. Yet within him a restlessness took root, subtle but persistent. He replayed conversations that had never occurred, answers to questions she had not asked, realizing too late that silence had not preserved peace, but had denied them truth. For the Duchess, exile proved both punishment and awakening. Removed from familiar protections, she was compelled to confront her own resilience. She settled where her name carried less weight, where her past invited curiosity but no authority. There, stripped of expectation, she learned to define herself not by marriage but by conscience. Grief remained, but it no longer governed her. Purpose, discovered reluctantly, began to steady her. Time passed as it does, indifferent to regret. Seasons changed without ceremony, and with each passing month, the distance between them seemed to solidify into permanence. Yet neither was untouched by what had been lost. He sensed an absence that no duty could fill. She discovered a strength she had not known she possessed. Both were altered, though neither understood how deeply. A year later, when her name resurfaced in conversation, spoken with cautious respect rather than judgment, the Duke felt a disquiet he could not explain. It was mentioned in passing, attached to charitable efforts and quiet influence, nothing that invited scandal, yet enough to disturb the careful order he had rebuilt. He realized then that silence had not ended their story. It had merely postponed its reckoning. What he could not yet know was how profoundly her absence had reshaped the balance between them. In leaving without protest, she had relinquished the role of the accused and claimed, unknowingly, the authority of restraint. Her silence, once interpreted as submission, had become a language of its own, one that refused to plead for understanding. This transformation unsettled him, because it suggested that the narrative he had accepted might never have been complete. For the Duchess, memory returned in quieter ways. It surfaced in moments of hesitation, in the instinct to weigh words carefully, in the reflex to assume fault before blame. Yet alongside these remnants of her former life grew a resolve that felt unfamiliar and quietly defiant. She no longer measured her worth by approval withheld or granted. If sorrow had shaped her, it had also refined her, teaching her the cost of silence and the necessity of voice. Thus, while society believed the matter concluded, its participants remained bound by unfinished truth. Each carried a version of the past that no longer aligned with the present, and in that dissonance lay the promise of reckoning. The Duke sensed the order he prized was fragile. The Duchess sensed the life she fled might yet demand an answer. Somewhere between them waited the moment when restraint would be tested. Tragedy returned not as loss, but as recognition, sudden and uninvited, striking where certainty had settled too comfortably. The Duchess had learned to survive without answers, yet fate offered questions instead, sharp enough to reopen wounds she had taught herself to close. Her name, once spoken with dismissal, now carried weight that unsettled those who remembered her departure. Respect, she discovered, could arrive long after affection had been denied. In the years since she left, she had cultivated a life governed by purpose rather than permission. Freed from expectation, she directed her energies toward quiet acts of service, believing usefulness to be a form of redemption. Children gathered under her guidance, not because of her title, which she rarely mentioned, but because she listened. Instruction became exchange, charity became companionship, and in those shared hours she found a steadiness that sorrow alone had not granted. Her work remained modest by design, for she understood how easily visibility invited judgment. Yet even modest virtue attracts attention, and whispers began to circulate, cautious but curious. They spoke of her composure, her intelligence, her refusal to trade dignity for sympathy. These murmurs reached circles she had never intended to touch again, carrying with them a quiet challenge to the narrative once imposed upon her. The Duke encountered her presence before he encountered her name. Financial ledgers, reviewed without sentiment, revealed allocations directed toward the same causes she supported. He approved them automatically, guided by principle rather than curiosity, unaware that his resources had begun to echo her intentions. When coincidence became pattern, he hesitated, troubled by a sense of familiarity he could not yet place. Only later did the connection reveal itself, spoken by another with casual certainty. The Duchess, it was said, had become indispensable to a certain charitable initiative, her guidance valued, her judgment trusted. The words unsettled him not because they surprised, but because they contradicted assumptions he had preserved for comfort. He had imagined her diminished by departure, softened by regret. Instead, she appeared to have grown formidable in ways that defied his understanding. The discovery provoked a reckoning he resisted. Pride urged him to dismiss the matter as irrelevant, yet conscience pressed otherwise. He recalled how easily he had mistaken her restraint for weakness, how readily he had accepted silence as consent. Now, faced with evidence of her quiet authority, he sensed the inadequacy of those conclusions. The tragedy, he realized, was not that she had left, but that he had never truly known her. Meanwhile, she remained unaware of his renewed attention, absorbed in the responsibility she had claimed. Her satisfaction came not from acknowledgement, but from continuity, from the assurance that what she built endured beyond individual notice. Still, when certain contributions arrived consistently, unaccompanied by expectation or inquiry, she recognized a familiarity in their discretion. Gratitude stirred uneasily beside memory. Speculation followed swiftly, for society tolerates virtue only until it challenges established order. Some suggested her influence exceeded propriety, others that her past disqualified her present. A few insinuated motives they could neither prove nor abandon. The Duchess faced these whispers with practiced calm, aware that reputation, once fractured, is rarely restored without resistance. She refused to explain herself, trusting that clarity born of patience would outlast rumor. The Duke, confronted with these same murmurs, experienced them differently. Where once he might have ignored such commentary, he now felt compelled to listen. The injustice of implication unsettled him, for he recognized its origin in the silence he had helped create. Defending her publicly would invite scrutiny he had long avoided, yet remaining detached felt increasingly untenable. His internal conflict mirrored the distance between duty and integrity. Between resolve and doubt lay a token whose meaning neither fully grasped. For her, it was a worn volume she carried daily, marked with notes from years of careful thought, once read in rooms where her voice had mattered little. Now its pages guided others, softened by use rather than neglect. For him, the token appeared as a signature, precise and restrained, offering support without condition. Each sensed the other's presence without certainty, and in that unspoken recognition, both felt the past stir, waiting to be answered. Tragedy struck as recognition, swift and merciless, because the past refused to remain buried when dignity demanded silence. At the charity assembly convened by careful minds, her name was spoken aloud, ending a year of distance. She felt the weight of it not as pride but as the cost of surviving truthfully. Within that utterance lived every choice she had made since leaving, measured, restrained, and uncelebrated it. The moment demanded composure, yet sorrow answered first, quiet, disciplined, and unyielding. It was then she knew the reckoning had begun. Nothing would remain untouched by what followed thereafter for all concerned souls. The Duke heard the same name differently, as a verdict pronounced upon his certainty and restraint. He had entered the hall governed by duty, prepared to observe without engagement. Instead he confronted consequence, shaped by absence, sharpened by time. Her existence beyond him unsettled assumptions he had never tested. The tragedy was not reunion, but recognition of fault long denied. He remained outwardly composed, yet inwardly divided between approach and retreat. Courtesy demanded distance, conscience urged confession. He chose neither, and that choice weighed heavily. Thus the past stood present, unsatisfied, awaiting courage he scarcely possessed at that fragile hour. She sensed his attention before his approach, an old awareness tempered by distance. Memory stirred without invitation, yet she refused its authority. Composure became her armor, earned through endurance rather than instruction. When he spoke her name privately, the sound carried history and restraint. She answered with formality, granting courtesy while guarding truth. In that exchange lay years of unspoken accusation and care. Neither acknowledged affection, yet both recognized its endurance. Tragedy softened into tension, heavy with possibility. She waited, unyielding, allowing him to decide whether courage would finally speak or retreat would prevail again under watchful moral consequence today. The conversation deepened cautiously, shaped by etiquette and fear of misstep. He returned a letter unopened, preserved by pride and hesitation. The gesture wounded and healed simultaneously, exposing restraint as cruelty. She accepted it without reproach, recognizing remorse in silence. Words followed carefully, measured like fragile heirlooms. He confessed not love but regret, and that admission altered balance. She replied not forgiveness but truth, acknowledging survival beyond him. The exchange redefined them as equals, wounded yet dignified. Something irretrievable passed. She departed first, reclaiming choice, leaving him with consequences that demanded action beyond reflection alone before silence hardened forever again. But the true shift came afterward, when absence no longer shielded him. He watched her leave with intention, not exile. That difference unsettled his certainty more than anger could. For her, departure felt altered, weighted by possibility rather than loss. Tragedy transformed into threshold, demanding courage from both. Neither spoke promises, yet both sensed continuation. Their silence now held intention, not fear. As night settled, each understood restraint could no longer suffice. Something awaited them, unnamed, unavoidable. It would demand a choice. Between honor and truth, love waited, patient, unresolved, and near, ready to challenge everything once preserved by silence. Tragedy returned clothed in rumor, subtle yet corrosive, because society forgives distance more readily than growth it cannot control. The Duchess discovered the shift not through accusation, but through hesitation, the sudden caution in voices that once spoke freely. Respect, she learned, is fragile when it threatens established comfort. Her work, once tolerated, now invited scrutiny precisely because it endured without permission. Silence again demanded something from her, though this time she refused its terms. The whispers followed a familiar pattern, cautious yet deliberate, suggesting impropriety without substance, influence without evidence. They questioned her presence, her authority, her right to be visible at all. She recognized the tactic immediately. What could not be undone would be undermined. To protest would invite spectacle. To withdraw would confirm suspicion. She chose instead to remain, steady and unyielding, trusting that integrity could withstand misinterpretation longer than fear could sustain it. The Duke heard the same murmurs with an unfamiliar urgency. Once, such commentary would have passed unnoticed, dismissed as idle conjecture. Now each insinuation struck him as a reckoning deferred too long. He recognized the source not in malice, but in the vacuum he had permitted. By refusing to speak before, he had allowed others to speak for him. The realization unsettled him more deeply than accusation ever could. He observed the change in tone toward her with growing unease, sensing the imbalance his silence had created. The restraint he once praised now appeared complicit, preserving order at the expense of justice. He understood then that neutrality was no longer possible. To remain apart was to participate in her diminishment. Honor, redefined by conscience rather than custom, demanded intervention. His decision was not immediate nor without fear. To speak would invite scrutiny, not merely of his intentions but of his past. Yet fear, once examined, proved insufficient justification for inaction. He resolved to act not as a former husband, but as a man bound to fairness. The distinction mattered. It preserved her autonomy while acknowledging his responsibility. The opportunity arrived without ceremony, as such moments often do. A gathering convened to address the future of the charitable initiative, its tone strained by uncertainty. Voices hesitated, careful not to align too visibly. The Duchess spoke with measured clarity, outlining progress and purpose without defensiveness. Her composure challenged the room, inviting either trust or retreat. The Duke listened, aware that his silence now carried consequence. When he spoke, it was not to praise her character but to affirm her work. He addressed outcomes rather than sentiment, integrity rather than affection. His words reframed the narrative, grounding her influence in fact rather than implication. The effect was immediate, though restrained. Resistance softened, suspicion recalibrated. He neither claimed intimacy nor denied history. Instead, he restored balance through acknowledgement. The gesture carried risk and he felt it keenly. Eyes turned toward him, assessing motives, recalculating alliances. He met their scrutiny without explanation, understanding that justification would weaken resolve. The Duchess did not look at him, yet she felt the shift, the subtle redistribution of weight. For the first time since leaving, she sensed support that did not seek possession. Afterward, they met briefly, privately, without arrangement. The exchange was quiet, stripped of ceremony. She thanked him without obligation. He replied without expectation. Between them passed an understanding neither named. His intervention had altered the landscape, not by reclaiming her but by honoring her independence. The distinction mattered more than apology. Yet the consequences of his choice extended beyond that moment. By speaking, he had invited reassessment of their history, reopening questions long settled by convenience. Society, once content with silence, now sensed unfinished business. The Duchess recognized the cost of his action and weighed it against her own resolve. She had not sought rescue. Yet she could not deny its impact. That evening, alone with thought, she acknowledged a shift within herself. Gratitude mingled with caution, hope tempered by memory. She understood that reconciliation, if it came, must arise not from defense, but from mutual truth. The Duke, likewise, recognized that intervention was only a beginning. Words spoken publicly demanded honesty privately. Between them stretched a narrowing distance, charged with possibility and risk. Silence no longer protected them. It beckoned, demanding definition. The tragedy that once divided them had evolved, no longer rooted in misunderstanding, but in the courage required to proceed. What awaited them was not reunion promised, but conversation unavoidable, and in that inevitability lay both threat and promise, poised to claim its due. Tragedy concluded not with collapse, but with decision, because endurance finally demanded direction rather than restraint. The Duchess woke knowing the silence between them could no longer be inhabited without cost. It pressed upon her like an unfinished sentence, asking to be completed or abandoned. She had rebuilt herself carefully, yet some foundations remained unsettled, awaiting truth rather than resolve. The Duke, equally wakeful, understood that honor required more than defense offered at a distance. His intervention had corrected an injustice, but it had also summoned responsibility he could no longer deny. He had spoken publicly with precision, now he must speak privately with honesty. Anything less would reduce courage to performance, and he would not permit himself that evasion again. They agreed to meet without intermediaries, without ceremony, acknowledging the gravity of such a choice. When they stood together, the past did not rush forward, it waited, attentive and severe. She regarded him steadily, no longer seeking reassurance. He met her gaze without expectation, aware that authority belonged to truth alone. He began by relinquishing claim, not to her affection, but to the narrative he had once accepted. He spoke of pride mistaken for principle, of silence wielded as control rather than care. Each admission stripped something rigid from him, leaving uncertainty in its place. She listened without interruption, recognizing the effort required to dismantle defenses long rewarded by society. When she spoke, her words were neither absolution nor indictment. She described survival without bitterness, growth without gratitude owed. She named the loneliness of being judged absent, the discipline of refusing to explain herself. In doing so, she reclaimed authorship of her own history, refusing to allow regret to define it. Her voice did not waver. It did not need to. Between them formed a clarity neither had known before. The marriage they had lost was acknowledged as irretrievable, shaped by constraints neither could undo. Yet what stood before them was not its shadow, but something newly possible, contingent upon equality rather than endurance. This recognition shifted the balance irrevocably. He offered partnership without demand, presence without possession. He asked not for restoration but for permission to proceed differently. The humility of the request altered its weight. She considered the cost, understanding that acceptance would invite scrutiny anew. Yet she also understood that refusal would preserve safety at the expense of truth. Her answer was measured, neither swift nor theatrical. She agreed to begin not as Duchess returned but as woman choosing. The distinction transformed agreement into agency. He accepted the terms without revision, recognizing that trust must be earned without haste. The world beyond them remained unchanged, governed by habit and observation. Yet within this accord lay quiet defiance, a refusal to allow convention to dictate outcome. They parted without promise of ease, aware that reconciliation would unfold under watchful judgment. Still, they carried forward a mutual understanding, fragile yet deliberate. As time resumed its ordinary pace, small confirmations replaced grand gestures. Conversation grew unguarded, respect deepened without urgency. What emerged was not passion reclaimed, but companionship redefined, grounded in accountability. Each learned to speak where once they withheld, to listen where once they presumed. The Duchess found that love offered without erasure strengthened rather than diminished her. The Duke discovered that authority shared increased rather than weakened him. Together, they navigated complexity with restraint transformed into choice. Society observed cautiously, uncertain how to interpret a union that refused familiar patterns. The tragedy that began in silence concluded in articulation, not because pain vanished, but because it was acknowledged. Yet resolution did not seal their future, it opened it. As they moved forward, neither could know whether endurance would be rewarded. What they knew was this: the silence that once divided them had been broken, and in its place stood a truth capable of sustaining whatever came next. Still, resolution carried its own weight, for choice invites consequence. The Duchess understood that reconciliation would be measured against expectations she had deliberately abandoned. She would be asked to justify autonomy softened by affection. The thought did not frighten her, but it clarified resolve. The Duke faced a parallel reckoning. By choosing transparency, he surrendered the shelter of unquestioned authority. He would be scrutinized for consistency. Such scrutiny demanded patience he had not always practiced. Their renewed association unsettled acquaintances who preferred conclusions over continuance. Some waited for failure, others for spectacle. Neither arrived. Instead, there was persistence, quiet and deliberate, resisting easy categorization. The Duchess continued her work without alteration, refusing to allow personal resolution to eclipse public purpose. The Duke supported without visibility, careful not to reclaim prominence. Their restraint affirmed intention rather than fear. Yet uncertainty lingered. Old wounds do not vanish at agreement, they wait, testing sincerity. Both recognized this truth and refused denial. They chose vigilance over assumption. One evening, after ordinary effort rather than gesture, they acknowledged what remained unresolved. It was not doubt of feeling but uncertainty of form. The question demanded courage, not haste. As they parted once more, not in separation but in continuity, neither mistook this moment for conclusion. Ahead lay judgment and adjustment. Yet for the first time, both stood within choice rather than constraint. The silence that once governed them receded, replaced by a question neither feared to answer. What might endure when truth rather than pride is allowed to lead? This understanding altered their sense of time. Urgency no longer ruled them, nor did delay. Each day became a measured step, accountable and chosen. The Duchess recognized a steadiness that did not threaten her independence. The Duke recognized humility as strength practiced daily. Though society continued to watch, neither performed. They consented to be known slowly. In that patience, tragedy lost its dominion, not erased but transformed, serving as reminder rather than master. What followed would test endurance, invite judgment, and demand honesty again. It promised uncertainty, accountability, mutual effort, and a future shaped deliberately by truth, patience, and courage rather than fear, habit, or inherited expectation.